Hello and welcome to Sleepless in Olympus. If you're here, chances are you're winding down, tucked in, or simply searching for a soft story to carry you into sleep. Whether you're already nestled into your blankets or still turning off the last lamp, I'm glad you wandered your way here tonight. We're going to take a gentle journey through myth stories older than the stars told not to dazzle, but to settle you into stillness. Tonight's tale follows a titan, not in war or rage, but in silence. We'll walk beside Atlas as he moves through gardens, skies, and the aching space between duty and peace. But don't worry, we'll keep things soft and slow. No booming thunderbolts, no dramatic crescendos, and absolutely no surprise battles with Zeus. Just a quiet unraveling of a story of strength, surrender, and the sky that never quite stays still now. I will admit, this myth might stir something in you, and if you find yourself staying awake not from restlessness, but from wonder, well, that's not such a bad way to greet the night. Before we begin, if you feel like it, let us know where you're listening from and what time is it where you are. It's a beautiful thing to imagine this thread of stories stretching across time zones. And if this gentle journey helps you relax, or just gives your mind something soft to hold, a like and subscribe would mean the world. It helps more night wanderers find their way here. All right then, let's begin our quiet walk through myth with the titan who held the sky. Before burden and before myth, there was a garden. Not a garden as mortals know them, with fences or neat rows. This garden had no edges, no borders, just expanse. It was a place where time drifted like pollen and light hung lazily from the leaves. Nothing was in a hurry. Even the shadows took their time. Atlas lived there once. He did not hold the sky. He did not bend under fate. He wandered, tall and silent, through the groves of sacred fig trees and the silver pools that mirrored stars not yet named. He was not alone, but he was often apart. Atlas was born of primordial things. His father, Iapetus, a titan of mortal lifespans. His mother, Clymene, an oceanid who sang lullabies in the salt of the sea. He had brothers, Prometheus, who burned with questions, Epimetheus, who moved backward through understanding, and Menoetius, who loved war too much. But Atlas, he was different. He was not the smartest, not the kindest, not the loudest. But even as a boy, if a Titan child can be called such, he carried a silence that made the world lean in to listen. He noticed things, the way mountains shifted when no one looked, the pause in the sky before thunder. He watched everything. And so, everything seemed to speak back. The garden did not need a keeper. It kept itself. But Atlas moved through it like a second breath. He watched the slow birth of rivers, the flaring spiral of new constellations reflected in still water. He listened to the roots of trees when they whispered warnings to one another. He placed his hand on the soil and waited until it pulsed back, an ancient, patient language. And when a hawk landed on a stone beside him and stared, unblinking, Atlas did not look away. He did not need to speak to be heard. That was the gift of the garden. It listened to those who knew how to see. In those days, strength was not conquest. It was endurance of wonder. Atlas would sit for hours beneath a tree, watching the curve of a leaf unfold, or the trembling breath of a deer that did not know what fear was yet. He lifted boulders not to prove himself, but to see what roots clung to them. He waded into deep lakes, not to conquer their darkness, but to feel how stillness changed the body. He did not chase. He did not rush. And so the world opened to him. but nothing remains untouched forever. Even in paradise, the tremors of change begin like hairline cracks. The earth grew restless. The stars began whispering of war. The gods, new, shining, wild, stirred on distant edges of sky. And one evening, while Atlas knelt by a spring and watched light bend across water, he felt something unfamiliar settle into his chest. A pressure, subtle, like the hint of a storm still days away. It was not yet burden, not yet fate, but it was the first time he wondered if peace could end. His brother Prometheus visited the garden sometimes. He brought stories of skies that could be stolen, of fire not yet born, of creatures shaped from clay and ambition. Atlas listened, quiet as always, but Prometheus burned when he spoke. His words leapt ahead of themselves, always racing toward the next truth. "You watch too much," Prometheus said once. "Someday you'll need to act." Atlas said nothing in reply, but later that night, under the silver glow of a moon still learning to shine, he wondered what action would feel like. Word came, slowly at first, like the rumble of distant thunder, then louder still. The gods were rising, younger than the Titans, quicker, hungrier. Zeus, Poseidon, Hades, names that did not echo with age, but with momentum. Cronus, father of time and king of the Titans, summoned his sons. Atlas went, though the garden tugged at his heel. "What would you have me carry?" he asked. "Everything," came the answer. And just like that, the garden faded behind him, not with destruction, but neglect. It did not need a goodbye. It only needed to be remembered. Atlas stood beside brothers, thunder in their hands and fury in their hearts. The world trembled. Mountains cracked from the shouting. The sea boiled with prophecy. And yet, Atlas looked skyward, not in fear, but in longing. It had once been so quiet. Now, even silence seemed sharpened. They marched to war, not knowing what they'd lose. Not just battles or land or sky, but the parts of themselves that had known stillness. Atlas walked forward, but in his mind, he was still beneath that tree. As they prepared for war, Atlas often returned inward to that space. He would close his eyes, and there it was, the breeze through olive branches, the patient gaze of the hawk, the murmur of tree roots far below. He held it not as nostalgia, but as anchor. If he was to become a weapon, he would carry a garden inside his chest. If the world must burn, he would remember the shape of stillness. And that, perhaps, is where burden begins. Not in weight, but in the refusal to forget what was once light. And still, beyond the reach of war, the garden remained. It did not mourn Atlas. It did not crumble in his absence. That was never its way. But when the last birdsong faded from the branches and the pond stopped showing stars, the garden paused, not out of sorrow, out of still, enduring hope. For gardens, you see, know how to wait, even for titans. Atlas had not yet fought, but already he had lost something. Not innocence. He was never naive. Not hope. It still lingered in the quiet corners of him, but he had lost the freedom to be unseen. In the garden, he was a presence among presences, no louder than a stone, no more important than a leaf. Now, eyes turned toward him, expectation sharpening like spears. He was no longer allowed to be quiet, and he mourned that most of all. The sky had not yet chosen sides. It watched the coming war with detached awe, as stars sometimes do. They blinked, they burned, but they did not bend. Not yet. Atlas would look up and wonder if they knew what was coming, if they pitied him, or simply waited. He tried to memorize their placement, not for navigation, but for comfort. He would need that memory soon. From the garden, Atlas had learned a kind of waiting, not passive, not idle, but rooted. Now, in camps of sharpening blades and boiling blood, he practiced that same stillness. When warriors shouted, he listened. When fires crackled, he stared through the flames. He was the calm before the quake, the exhale before the blow. And though no one saw it, his restraint held more strength than any war cry. One night, Prometheus returned. His hands now glowed with stolen fire. "Do you still dream of leaves?" he asked. Atlas did not reply. "Then guard them," said Prometheus, "or this war will burn everything you once loved." And with that, he vanished into the night, chasing a future only he could see. Atlas remained rooted. There comes a breath before all great storms. Atlas stood on the edge of the battlefield, sky stretching above him like an unbroken truth. His hands had never held weapons, but his shoulders already ached, not from burden, but from becoming the kind of being who would be asked to carry it. The garden was gone, but he remembered the path, and that, he decided, would have to be enough. In the heart of the camp, as warriors trained and shouted and laughed too loudly, Atlas sat beside a dying fire. He pressed his palm to the earth and listened. Beneath the noise, the ground still hummed, not with fear, not with urgency, but with an old rhythm, the garden's rhythm, the beat of things not needing to prove themselves. He held that sound the way a warrior holds a shield, quietly, steadily, because soon everything would try to drown it. The next morning, someone burned olive branches by mistake. The scent curled through the camp like memory, sharp, bittersweet, oddly sacred. Atlas froze. For a moment, he saw it again. The trees, the glinting water, the unbothered animals walking through dappled light. He did not cry. Titans do not cry. But the ache behind his eyes was older than battle, and it would not go away. The waiting, it turned out, was its own kind of burden. Every day, the war neared. Every night, Atlas slept with one ear turned toward silence, hoping to hear something he had lost. But there were no more birdsongs, no more slow winds through cedar, only the creak of armor, the murmur of tactics, the endless rehearsal of pain. And somewhere inside him, a quiet resolve began to harden. If he must carry a burden, he would do it with grace, not because he saw glory, but because something once beautiful had whispered to him, and he had listened. On the last night before the battle, Atlas stood alone on a high ridge. He looked to the stars one final time. They no longer blinked with curiosity. They glared, distant, brilliant, expectant. He squared his shoulders, not because he knew what was coming, but because he sensed that the sky, unfallen, watching, was not just a ceiling. It was a mirror. And if he must become something eternal, let it be not in strength, but in stillness. And so the garden ended, not in flame, not in flood, but in forgetting. Time moved forward. The stars chose their sides, and Atlas, silent as ever, stepped into the world that would ask him for everything. But deep beneath the coming burden, one thing remained. The memory of leave, the memory of stillness, the memory of who he had been, before the sky, before the war, before the weight. That memory he carried with him, and it would never fall. Chapter 2. The War That Broke the World. The garden was behind him now, and before him, rumble. Not the soft thunder of distant clouds, but something deeper, older. A sound that cracked through the bones of mountains and woke long-buried fears in the oceans. The world, once a silent companion, had begun to raise its voice. This was not change. This was fracture. An atlas, whose every breath once blended with wind and soil, now stood on a land that felt foreign. It vibrated with the footsteps of gods. In the great hall of the Titans, stone and sky and arrogance tangled in architecture. Cronus spoke. His voice was jagged like cliffs, bitter with age. He saw the rise of his sons, the new gods, as treachery, as theft, as rebellion that needed crushing. He called his children to arms. Atlas, Prometheus, Menoetius, Epimetheus. We are not the past, Cronus thundered. We are the root. And Atlas listened, not because he agreed, but because this, too, was nature. The cycle. The older resisting the younger. The moment before collapse. The silence of the garden had not prepared him for this. Before the first weapon was raised, the sky cracked, not with lightning, but with sides. Zeus and his kin took the high winds, dragging storms behind their chariots. Poseidon churned the oceans into weapons. Hades gathered silence, making it sharp. And from the earth, the Titans rose, mountain-blooded, deep-rooted, ancient. Atlas looked up. The stars he had once memorized now blinked erratically, as if choosing. He felt the moment a sky became a battlefield. He would never look at it the same again. The Titanomachy did not resemble mortal wars. There were no borders, no maps, no strategies laid out on sand. This was element against element, fury against fury. Winds howled names that hadn't been spoken in millennia. Mountains lifted and were hurled like stones. Rivers bled. Forests screamed. Atlas moved like a monolith through it all, his silence mistaken for certainty. He did not shout. He did not pray. But when he struck, the earth remembered. Not all Titans stayed loyal. Prometheus, always too curious for loyalty, saw the end coming like a tide. He slipped away from the battlefield and offered his wisdom to Zeus. Fire, insight, invention. Not for love, for belief. He believed in the future, even if it broke the present. Atlas saw his brother's absence like a missing constellation. He did not speak of it, not yet. But something cracked deeper than the battlefield, and not even war could drown that sound. Menoetius, brother of Atlas, burned with a fire that made him reckless. He saw battle as glory. He welcomed pain like a friend. His laughter echoed across valleys even as they collapsed. But might alone could not win this war. A bolt from Zeus, pure thought wrapped in storm, struck him down. Not because he was weak, but because he was too loud to notice it coming. Atlas did not weep. He simply stood, breathing slower. Another crack in his chest. Another silence lost. The Olympians fought like lightning learns to walk. They had rhythm and arrogance. But more than that, they had belief. That the world belonged to them. Not to roots and stone, but to ambition, hunger, motion. They laughed as they fought. Atlas had never heard joy in war before. It unsettled him more than blood. There is a kind of scream that only a mountain can make. Not a cry. A collapse. In one clash between titans and gods, the cliffs of Thessaly fractured. Boulders rolled like thunder. Caves crushed their own secrets. Atlas stood among the wreckage, shoulder slashed by debris, but unmoved. He watched as trees that had once spoken to him were shattered into silence. And still, he did not raise his voice. Atlas rarely struck first, but when he did, the sky rippled. He threw a blow into the air itself, and wind collapsed. He drove his fist into a river, and it remembered stillness. He was not wild like Menicius, not brilliant like Prometheus. He was enduring, a kind of strength the gods didn't yet understand, but they would learn. But endurance has limits. For every mountain raised by a titan, the gods answered with skyfire. For every forest shielded, Poseidon erased coastlines. The world began to look unrecognizable. Burned, drowned, scorched, silent. Atlas began to wonder if there would be anything left to protect. And still, he fought. Not for Cronus, not for power, but for the memory of a garden that once knew his name. The ground opened, not metaphorically, but truly. Canyons cracked, swallowing whole armies. Spectres rose with the scent of minerals and mourning. Hades did not scream or boast. He simply arrived. Atlas faced him once briefly, just long enough to feel the chill of inevitability. He struck stone, not shadow, and the shadow did not flinch. Some things cannot be moved by muscle. It did not happen in a final battle, but slowly. Cronus, time itself, grew brittle. Each defeat made him older. Each blow a wrinkle in eternity. When Zeus faced him, there was no triumph, just exhaustion, the inevitability of succession. Atlas turned away from the fall of his father. He felt no loyalty to age for its own sake. He thought of the garden, and then of what had been lost to get here. One by one, the Titans fell. Oceanus drowned himself in sorrow. Coeus vanished into madness. Hyperion wept light, then disappeared. They did not all die. Some simply ended. Their stories no longer carried forward. Atlas fought longer than most, but he too began to feel the pull. A weightless ache in his bones. A sky looking for someone to hold it. They say Atlas stood alone at the gates of Olympus. No reinforcements, no war cries, only him. He raised a mountain with both hands, not to throw but to carry. He bore it like memory. The gods came, not as soldiers, but as inevitabilities. And when they offered him surrender, he said nothing, only exhaled, a breath like a falling tree. Zeus did not gloat. Victory, he knew, was its own curse. He looked at Atlas and saw not enemy, but echo, a reminder of weight and silence. Still, justice had to be rendered, not execution, not exile, something more fitting. A burden worthy of one who had once held mountains in his hands. And so, the sentence was spoken. Atlas would carry the sky. It did not fall with thunder and did not crash like waves or scream like fire. The sky settled onto Atlas like an old truth rediscovered. A weight not of stone or wind, but of permanence. He did not resist. He did not kneel. He simply caught it. And in that moment, the world restructured itself. It was not chains. It was not prison. It was posture. Atlas would stand, always, bearing not punishment, but memory. The gods saw a sentence. He saw continuity. What better way to remember what had been lost than to carry it forever? The gods celebrated. Temples were carved. Hymns were sung. Olympus rose. But beneath it all, Atlas stood. He was not worshipped. He was not thanked. He became part of the sky's furniture, a silhouette on the edge of eternity. And even the stars, once familiar, stopped blinking. Still, he remembered, when the wind passed over Atlas's ears, it carried with it stories from the world below, lovers, poets, soldiers, children. He heard them all. He bore the sky, but beneath it, he heard life. That was enough. That was weight. That was what remained. The Titanomachy ended not with a final cry, but with a held breath. A moment suspended, Atlas, now alone in both posture and memory, carried what others could not remember. And in that silence, something new began to grow. Not a garden, but the shadow of one. And sometimes, in the sky, even now, the shape of his burden trembles. Still, waiting, remembered. When Prometheus left, he didn't run. He walked, slow, measured, as if every footstep marked a chapter turning. Atlas watched him from across the battlefield, not with anger, but with ache. Prometheus had always seen possibilities, but possibilities cost things. He imagined his brother standing among the gods, offering ideas like apples, shiny, poisoned, promising. It wasn't betrayal, it was belief. And belief, in times of war, could be the sharpest wound of all. The Olympians didn't just fight, they reveled. To them, war was not tragedy, it was performance. Poetry written in sparks and strikes. Each movement of Zeus's hand painted streaks across the sky. Each tide Poseidon summoned sang with bravado. Atlas, rooted in older rhythms, found it disorienting. Not because they were stronger, but because they believed they deserved to win. That kind of faith was foreign to Titans, who carried the world not for reward, but because someone had to. When the war ended, the silence was not peace. It was ash. Zeus approached Atlas with caution. He did not raise his voice nor carry lightning. What passed between them wasn't war. It was resignation. "You will carry the sky," he said. But what he meant was, "We don't know what else to do with you." And what Atlas heard was, "You are the only one who can." There were no chains forged, no guards stationed. His punishment was posture, stillness as destiny. And over time, the stillness did not weaken him. It refined him. Atlas began to sense patterns in the stars. The same way he once read the wind in the garden, he now read the pulses of galaxies. The sky spoke, not in language, but in repetition. And repetition, Atlas had learned, was a kind of wisdom. Below, the world forgot. Temples fell out of style. Names became metaphors. Children asked who the Titans were, and parents shrugged. But Atlas remembered. He remembered the first time his feet touched soil, the first time a tree bowed toward him in breeze, the first time he felt time move through his hands. And though no statue bore his name, and no hymn echoed in his honor, he carried something none of the gods did: perspective, the long view, the still view, the view from beneath it all. Chapter 3, Shouldering the Sky. There are weights we lift, and weights we become. The moment the sky settled onto Atlas's shoulders, the world seemed to hush. Not out of reverence, but from recognition. The silence was not absence. It was adjustment. The world realigned itself around him. Birds still flew. Winds still blew. But everything took a wider path, as if the world now orbited his endurance. Atlas did not speak. He did not weep. He simply stood. And the silence of the garden became the silence of the cosmos. The burden was not only celestial, it was spiritual. Atlas could feel the weight not just in his back or bones, but in memory. Each star pressing down carried history, regret, and the longing of forgotten things. He began to hear their whispers, not voices, tensions, the sound of light folding into itself, myths gathering moss. He understood now. The sky was not just space, it was responsibility, and it had chosen him. Time does not pass the same way when you are still. Atlas's hands had once lifted mountains. Calm beasts shaped the landscape with quiet intention. Now they held only the vast weight of sky. His fingers began to forget motion, but they remembered shape, pressure, memory stored in muscle. He imagined holding the soft bark of his favorite tree, the rounded stones by the riverbank, the braided grass of his resting place, all now intangible, yet more vivid than the stars above. Sometimes what we carry is not the weight, but the longing for what we cannot touch again. With each breath, Atlas began to know the stars, not by name, but by weight. He felt which constellations leaned east, which clusters hummed with the vibration of future storms. His spine became a compass for cosmic tremors. Galaxies shifted like tectonic plates across his back. Solar winds tugged his posture. Time unfolded not in hours, but in gravity. Atlas did not see the universe. He felt it, folding and unfolding across his shoulders. And in its quiet shifts, he began to sense something even stranger than time: pattern. Though he could not leave his post, the world occasionally came to him. Birds passed overhead. Storms flirted with his silence. But more often than not, it was humans. Priests seeking wisdom, warriors seeking strength, poets seeking metaphor. They came to ask questions, though he never answered. They left offerings, stones, feathers, verses, bread. He never moved, never spoke. But every visitor left changed. Sometimes the answer isn't a voice. Sometimes it's the presence that doesn't flinch. Atlas knew what was happening below. He heard lovers whispering under olive trees. He felt earthquakes like skipped heartbeats. He sensed the moment a civilization discovered iron, or war, or sorrow. He knew when a child died and a mountain cried with it. He felt when the sea took back a coastal village and left behind only names. Each pain pressed upward, embedding itself into the fabric of sky. He carried them all, not as punishment, but as witness. There were times when the sky grew restless. Clouds crashed like arguments. Lightning danced like prophecy. The moon turned her face away. In those moments, Atlas imagined that the heavens were angry, not at him, but for him. That the burden, sensing its own cruelty, rebelled against itself. It was a lie. He knew it. But lies, like myths, have power. And sometimes, even titans need stories to survive. The first winter under the sky felt endless. Atlas had never truly felt cold before. Titans, born of earth and chaos, knew temperature as suggestion, not rule. But now, the chill of space pressed in from above. Frost gathered along his shoulders like stardust. Comets scraped silence across his spine. Still, he did not shiver. He only listened. Winter was not death. It was waiting. And Atlas, now more still than stone, became its perfect student. From far below, stories began to rise. Villages whispered of the giant who held up the world. Some said he had angered the gods. Others claimed he volunteered. Some even believed he was the sky. Atlas could not correct them. He would not if he could, because every myth that rose to meet him lightened the weight, just slightly. They were wrong, but they were beautiful. And beauty, like memory, adds lift. Atlas began to measure silence in shapes. There was the silence after a storm, wide and clean. The silence of morning, heavy and slow. The silence of stars, sharp and unending. Each had a gravity of its own, a lesson. He learned to read the world not by sound, but by what followed it. In this way, even the mute cosmos became a kind of symphony. Sometimes he thought of what lay below, not just the forests or oceans, but the cradle, the place where all things began and would someday return. He imagined holding it in his hands, not as burden, but as child. He did not regret his sentence. He regretted only that he could not touch the world again. To hold something tenderly was a power greater than strength, and he, of all beings, remembered how it felt. One day, long after Olympus had grown bored of him, and mortals forgot to leave offerings, and stars lost their novelty, everything went quiet, even the wind. Atlas held his breath. It was not death. It was not sleep. It was a moment outside of time, a pause in the cosmos. And in that pause he realized something profound. He had become part of the sky, not just its bearer, but its voice. In his stillness, the universe had found its anchor. Generations passed, civilizations rose and fell, names changed, languages dissolved, but Atlas remained. Eventually, people stopped looking up, not because they forgot, but because the sky became ordinary. That, he realized, was the true vanishing. To become not invisible, but accepted, blended into the backdrop of being. And yet, he did not despair, because ordinary things are the foundations of worlds. He became myth, yes, but also infrastructure. The longer he carried the sky, the more he understood. The burden was not punishment, it was pedagogy. To hold something endlessly, you begin to know it, not with facts, but with bone, with breath. Atlas became fluent in sky. He sensed when a planet sighed, when a nebula dreamed, when a star finished its last sentence. His burden had taught him to read silence like scripture. On some nights, when the clouds parted just so, the moon would hover a little lower. She never spoke directly, but Atlas felt her questions. Does it still hurt? Will you ever rest? And he would answer, not with words, but posture, with the subtle angle of his neck, the quiet strength in his spine. Sometimes silence is a conversation, and he had become a master of it. What would happen when he could no longer hold it? He wondered, not with dread, but with curiosity. Would another rise to take his place? Or would the sky learn to float on its own? He hoped for the latter, because the greatest gift of burden is to eventually render itself unnecessary. Atlas did not seek legacy. He sought release, not for himself, but for the weight. In the final centuries, he began to imagine memory differently, not as stories or statues, but as presence, as weight shared across time. He knew he was remembered, not because people prayed, but because the wind still bowed around him. the stars still curved with deference. He was no longer a titan holding a sky. He was the sky's memory of being held, and that was enough. At some point, he couldn't say when, the sky felt different, not lighter, but more familiar. Like a friend who once leaned too hard now rested gently. Atlas realized it was not the weight that changed, it was him. He had become fluent in burden, and in doing so, had become more than a bearer. He had become a part of what he held. Integration, not endurance, was the final lesson. Stillness, once a prison, became a practice. He learned that repetition could create not just boredom, but structure, rhythm, insight. He became the monk of the cosmos, the breath beneath every sunrise, the pause between every thunderclap. Through his stillness, he reminded the universe that not all power must move to matter. Sometimes it is what refuses to move that holds everything in place. And then one night, the sky noticed him. He felt it, a shift in light, a warming in the airless breath of stars. The cosmos was no longer indifferent. It saw him, not as servant, not as relic, but as keeper. And in that moment, for the first time in eons, Atlas smiled, not because the burden had lifted, but because he knew it never would, and that he, finally, was okay with that. There is no ending, only continuation. Atlas still stands. He will stand tomorrow. He will stand when the last myth is forgotten and the stars fold back into silence. And yet, he is not frozen. He moves in unseen ways, in the tilt of a planet, in the patience of a sunrise, in the resilience of those who carry more than they think they can. He is not waiting, he is holding. And that, perhaps, is the most sacred act of all. Chapter 4. The day the skies shifted. The silence had become familiar. Atlas, long ago hardened into cosmic habit, did not count time in hours or years, but in degrees of stillness. The stars passed through him like breath, and the earth spun below as if unaware of the weight above. But then, one day, something changed. It wasn't loud. It wasn't even sudden. It was subtle, like the moment before a storm when the air thickens just enough to make you pause. The sky trembled, not a quake, not a fall, but a tilt. Atlas felt it first in his jaw, then down his spine. A vibration, foreign and ancient, as if the burden he had come to understand had learned a new language overnight. And he knew something was coming. The light bent strangely that day. A shadow, not of cloud, but of presence, drifted across the curvature of the cosmos. Atlas did not flinch, but he noticed. A tremor passed through the weight on his shoulders, like the aftershock of an old regret. He remembered shadows from long ago, when gods moved like fire across battlefields, when brothers turned to monsters, when promises outlived those who made them. But this shadow was different. It felt curious, less like a threat, more like a question. And for the first time in millennia, Atlas wondered if something had come to ask, not take. He heard them before he saw him. Footsteps, strong, steady, mortal. The kind that didn't ask permission. They approached from the west, where mountains folded into myth and roads whispered of old labors. Heracles. Atlas hadn't spoken his name in epochs, but the sound of those steps returned it to him like a lost chord. The demigod approached without reverence, carrying no prayer, only purpose. When he arrived, he didn't kneel. He didn't speak of the sky or the burden. He simply stood there, watching the Titan. And in that stillness, Atlas felt something stir in his chest that had not moved since before the war. Recognition. Heracles needed something. It was always like that with mortals. They came not to worship, but to ask. But Atlas didn't fault him. What was the point of endurance if it couldn't be offered? Heracles needed the golden apples, the fruit of eternity guarded deep within the garden Atlas once knew well. Only Atlas could retrieve them. Only Heracles could hold the sky in his absence. And so, the Titan made a choice. He shifted the sky, just enough for the weight to slide toward the demigod, and for the first time in ages, he moved. It was unbearable. Atlas stepped carefully among the roots. Every leaf seemed to whisper, "You are not supposed to be here." And still, the apples glowed, like stars caught in branches. He held one of the golden apples in his hand. Its skin was smooth, impossibly warm. A light pulse, like a heartbeat, danced beneath its surface. Atlas considered eating it. Just one bite. Eternity in exchange for eternity. But that was not the deal. He plucked the fruit gently, placed it in the woven pouch Heracles had left, and turned back toward the burden he had never truly left behind. Yet even as he walked, something followed him. Not Heracles, not fate, but a sliver of something he had never felt before. Doubt. Atlas returned to find Heracles lounging beneath the curve of the sky. The demigod looked up, smiled, and stretched his arms with the satisfaction of one who knows the moment is ending. Atlas opened his hand, offering the fruit. Heracles stood, nodded once, and stepped aside. And Atlas, without complaint, without hesitation, stepped back beneath the cosmos. But something had shifted. The sky was heavier now, not in mass, in meaning. It no longer felt like punishment. It felt like choice. Back beneath the sky, Atlas closed his eyes. He could still smell the apples, still feel the warm soil of the garden between his toes, still hear the laughter of the river, the hum of gold. Motion had not freed him, but it had reminded him. He was not stone. He was not silence. He was memory, wrapped in strength, softened by time. And though he had returned to his burden, he carried it differently now, not as exile, but as witness. In the days that followed, the sky seemed to shift differently. It no longer pressed blindly. It adjusted, reacted, echoed, as if it too remembered that Atlas had left once and returned. As if it respected him more, not for holding it, but for coming back. There was grace in that unspoken bond, a recognition that even burdens, when chosen again, become something closer to sacred. Atlas tilted his head back. A single star flickered above. He nodded. The sky somehow nodded back. Atlas stood as he always had, but nothing felt the same. Stillness had once been his nature, his identity, but now it itched. It stretched. It asked questions. He had tasted freedom, not long enough to live in it, but long enough to recognize its shape. And in that knowing, the burden pressed not just on his shoulders, but on his mind. Stillness is not absence of motion. Sometimes it is the weight of all the roads not taken. The next pilgrim came a week later. She brought no offerings, only a question. Why did you come back? Atlas did not speak. He never did. But the question rippled through him like a thrown stone. He wondered how she knew. If Heracles had told the tale, or if stories, like winds, always find their way to the ears that need them. She did not wait for an answer. She only sat beneath him, silent and steady, as if she knew the real answers can only be felt. He began to see the sky differently. Where once there were stars, now there were stories. Where once there was weight, now there was shape. Echoes of every thought he'd never spoken, every myth that had passed him by. The sky, he realized, did not just rest on him. It reflected him. Every muscle, every memory, every choice. He was no longer a bearer of heaven. He was part of it. Atlas had always been strong, but strength, he now knew, was not what kept the sky aloft. Endurance did. And after endurance, understanding. He did not resist the weight now. He balanced it. He did not defy the stars. He listened to them. In his stillness, there was movement. In his silence, there was story. This was not surrender. This was evolution. Late one night, a comet tore across the sky. For the briefest of moments, it painted the heavens with fire. Atlas watched it pass and remembered a time when fire had meaning, when the world was young and war had not yet made gods out of tyrants. The comet whispered to him, not in words, but in warmth. And Atlas, holding the whole of heaven, remembered something vital. Even in great stillness, you are allowed to burn. Atlas no longer questioned the stillness. It had once been cage and curse. Now it was rhythm. He began to notice the patterns, subtle shifts in the celestial breath, quiet contractions in the spine of the sky. Holding the cosmos was not the same as pausing it. He was not still because he had to be. He was still because he chose to be. Stillness was not absence. It was alignment. Sometimes, when the wind curled just right, Atlas swore he could hear Heracles laugh. The sound didn't echo, it folded, bent around the sky like a smile too large to see directly. He remembered the boy's strength, his boldness, his pain, hidden behind myth. Atlas felt no envy, only gratitude. For even in trickery, Heracles had given him something no god ever had. A moment. Each day, the stars moved a little differently, not because the sky had changed, but because Atlas had. He understood now. His power was never in the holding. It was in the returning. Others may run from their burdens, disguise them, pass them off. But Atlas had done what few dared. He stepped away and came back, not out of obligation, but out of clarity. And so, the sky settled once more, not as a burden, not as a crown, but as an agreement. Titan and cosmos bound not by punishment, but by presence. No more rebellion, no more escape, only the deep, enduring grace of one who has known freedom and still chooses to stay. Atlas exhaled. The stars pulsed above. The world continued below. And in that space between movement and memory, he held it all. Atlas sometimes wondered how many others now stood beneath unseen skies. Not titans, not gods, but ordinary people with invisible weights, the grief that wakes with them, the responsibilities no one else sees, the endless to-do list with no applause at the end. He understood them. For hadn't he once been a soldier, a brother, a rebel, all before becoming a metaphor? Now he was something else, a silent patron of those who hold the world quietly. He often looked up, not to escape, but to remember. Each constellation held a story. Some were battles, others were songs, a few were warnings. But the stars that meant the most to Atlas were the quiet ones, unmarked, unnamed, just faint enough to miss if you blink. They were the ones no myth spoke of, but he remembered them, because some things, like burdens, like peace, shine brightest without needing to be noticed. If anyone had asked, Atlas would not have called himself divine. He left titles to others. The gods had temples, songs and scandals. He had silence and time. But in the spaces between breaths, when the world slowed just enough to listen, some believed they could hear him, not as thunder, but as stillness, the kind that holds you when no one else does, the kind that says you don't have to run anymore. And maybe, just maybe, that was God enough. Chapter 5, Weight and Wisdom. The weight never changed. Stars spun, planets tugged, gravity whispered, but the burden itself remained constant. What shifted was Atlas. He had held the sky for so long that the strain had become indistinguishable from the silence. But after motion, after return, after the brush with freedom, he began to feel every nuance of the cosmos pressing down. Not just the mass, the meaning. And slowly, he began to understand. The burden wasn't just a punishment. It was a teacher. He had once believed strength was the resistance of pressure, the ability to never falter, to hold without question, to stand through chaos like a mountain unmoved. But the truth whispered differently now. Strength, he learned, was not in how long you could carry, but in how clearly you could see what you were carrying. It wasn't resistance. It was relationship. He didn't hold the sky because he had no choice. He held it because he knew what happened if no one did. There was a time when Atlas thought himself limitless. He had challenged Olympus, defied fate, and endured the judgment of the gods. But even titans crack. In stillness, he began to understand the importance of limits, not as weakness, but as sacred contour. Boundaries did not constrain wisdom, they revealed it. He was strong not because he could hold everything. He was wise because he knew what to put down. Atlas began to sense shapes in his thinking, curves, not lines. He no longer rushed to conclusions. He allowed questions to breathe, to echo back before answering. The sky taught him patience. When you carry something that never stops pressing, you must learn the rhythm of it. Like tide and moon, inhale and exhale. He listened to the cosmos, not for permission, but for pattern. It was there, always there, a language written in stars. Wisdom wasn't certainty, it was curiosity, held long enough to mature into clarity. Stillness was never absence, it was invitation. While the gods roared and mortals raced, Atlas listened. He heard prayers, some meant for other gods, some whispered half hoping someone like him might be listening. He did not answer, but he remembered every one. A sailor's final plea in a storm, a widow's whispered name into her pillow, a child asking the stars to bring her father home. These were not burdens, these were truths, stories, and stories he knew were heavier than any sky. He had once spoken in roars, in battle cries, in the language of rebellion. Now he spoke in silence, and in that silence the sky responded. It groaned differently when grief passed below. It tightened when cruelty reigned. It shimmered when a single act of kindness broke through despair. Atlas began to see how his burden was never just celestial. It was emotional, reflective, alive. Every human weight pressed upward, and in that press, Atlas felt not crushed, but connected. Some burdens remember you. The sky was one of them. It did not forget who had held it first. who had resisted, who had surrendered. Every shift in pressure carried memory. Every vibration held echoes of history. Atlas came to feel these echoes. Titanomachy scars, Promethean fire, the tremors of Heracles' hands during the brief exchange. They weren't ghosts, they were reminders. You do not carry a burden alone, not when it's stitched from centuries. He began to hear others like him, not titans, not gods, but humans whose burdens mirrored his own in shape, if not in size. He heard them in dreams. A mother holding a family together while breaking inside. A student staring at books through tears they couldn't explain. A doctor who carried death and still tried to heal. They never asked for help, only endurance. And in his quiet vigil, Atlas offered it, not through action, but through presence. "I see you," he whispered in silence, "and you're not failing just because it's hard." Atlas learned balance not through perfection, but through adaptation. Some days the sky pressed harder. Other days, it seemed to lift on its own, just slightly, just enough. He stopped chasing equilibrium as a static point. Instead, he treated balance as a dance. One step adjustment, one step trust. He leaned into gravity some days, resisted others. Let the stars rearrange themselves above him. That was wisdom too, knowing when to push and when to yield. He didn't always know the right answer, but he knew how to stay standing long enough to hear it. There were truths Atlas could name, and others he dared not. Not because they were forbidden, but because they weren't finished. Some wisdom only arrived when one stopped chasing it. Like mist, it gathered in still places. So he waited, trusted. Not every burden has a name. Not every answer belongs to the present. Some wisdom you hold the shape of before you ever hold the words. From below, people imagined Atlas as a statue, frozen, eternal, untouched by emotion. They didn't see the moments he trembled, not from strain, but from awe. A flock of birds passing just beneath the curve of the sky. A solar flare flickering like candlelight through his palms. A lunar eclipse that cast shadows like brushstrokes across the earth. These were not interruptions. They were affirmations. Even in wait, beauty persisted. Some days, Atlas didn't feel like he was holding the sky. He felt like the sky was holding him. Its vastness reflected his own. Its quiet endurance mirrored his posture. The turning galaxies, like thoughts circling in slow meditation, reminded him that motion could be gentle. The cosmos didn't ask him to be unbreakable. It asked him to be honest. And in that honesty, he found something sturdier than stone. He found himself. One night, Atlas imagined letting someone else hold the sky again. Not out of fatigue, out of compassion, because what he carried, others might carry someday. Not the weight of stars, but the weight of responsibility, of silence, of unseen strength. He wondered what wisdom he would pass on, and realized it would not be how to hold. It would be how to endure without forgetting who you are beneath the burden. Some burdens crush, others carve. Atlas came to see that his burden had done both, first breaking him, then shaping him. He was not who he had been before the sky. He had depth now, stillness, a vocabulary for pain that did not need to scream to be heard. The act of holding had become something more than service. It had become healing, not just for the world, but for himself. He often spoke to gravity, not as a force, but as a presence. "I see you," he would say. "I feel you, but I'm not afraid of you anymore." Gravity didn't reply, but sometimes it softened, eased its grip, shifted its tone. It reminded him that burdens weren't always punishment. Sometimes they were proof of connection. Atlas wasn't alone because he bore weight. He was connected because he chose to stay beneath it. No myths honored stillness. No songs praised the patient. But Atlas knew, without the silent ones, nothing stood. He thought of builders, parents, healers, the caretakers who carried futures in their arms and never asked for monuments. He thought of everyone who ever whispered, "I've got you," and meant it. If he had one legacy, let it be this: that quiet strength is still strength. That unseen effort still holds the sky. There would always be more weight, more motion, more myths, but wisdom wasn't about stopping the world. It was about learning how to stand while it turned. Atlas, once the rebel, once the punished, had become something else entirely. A philosopher made of stone, a god whose teachings needed no temple, only time. And as stars traced ancient roots overhead, he closed his eyes. He no longer needed to see the sky. He had become part of it. Most of Atlas's time passed in shadows, the hours when no prayers rose, when the world slept, when even the stars felt quieter. Those hours held a different kind of weight, not heavier, just lonelier. But he didn't dread them. He welcomed their stillness like an old companion. It was in these silent stretches that he often reflected on those who carried burdens unnoticed. The nurse in a dim hallway, the teacher grading long after the bell, the single father fixing tomorrow's lunch by the light of a flickering bulb. Atlas carried with them, not above, not apart, but in rhythm. Because what was wisdom, if not the choice to witness what others ignore? Atlas began to think of his posture not as endurance, but as sculpture. Each moment spent beneath the weight chiseled something unseen. Not muscle, not bone, but character. Compassion grew in the pressure points. Empathy where the sky pressed hardest. In the curve of his shoulders, the arc of a truth began to form. The heaviest things we carry are often the ones that shape us best. And the shaping never ends. It only becomes quieter, subtler, sacred. Sometimes, when the stars aligned just so, the sky became a mirror, not one that showed his reflection, but the reflection of everyone who had ever carried something too long, too quietly. He saw them there, not as shadows, but constellations. A mechanic who fixed what others gave up on. A sister who raised her siblings while burying her childhood. A stranger who smiled even when no one smiled back. They were all skybearers in their own right, and in the cosmic mirror, Atlas saw that his wisdom was never meant to be kept. It was meant to be shared. Chapter 6. The rebels rest. Before the burden, before the silence, there had been fury. Atlas had not always been still. He was once motion incarnate, defiant, roaring, aflame with purpose. The rebellion against Olympus hadn't been quiet, and it certainly hadn't been hopeless. It was driven by a belief that the Titans could shape a better world, and in that belief, Atlas had burned like a falling star. When the war ended, so too did that fire, or so he thought. But even beneath the crushing vault of the sky, even in solitude, the fight never truly slept. It hummed under his skin, a memory of momentum. He didn't rage anymore, but the residue of resistance remained, and so rest became foreign, unnatural, untrustworthy. Because if he paused, if he loosened his grip, what would remain of him? When a body moves long enough in the battle, it forgets how to be still. Atlas's bones knew resistance like breath, not because he wanted to fight forever, but because stillness meant reckoning. And reckoning was always heavier than any sky. He began to notice a new kind of ache, not from the celestial pressure, but from the absence of motion. There was a pain that lived in pause. He would shift his stance, not from fatigue, but from reflex. The ghost memory of shields lifted, of blows dodged, of orders shouted across cosmic battlefields. Now there was only wind, wind through silence, wind through centuries. And in it, Atlas found a deeper discomfort. Rest required vulnerability. And for someone who had once challenged gods, that was the greatest risk of all. It did not come all at once. Rest arrived like dusk, not sudden, but inevitable. It crept into Atlas's awareness like a tide that had always known the shore. One night, or what passed for night beneath the stars, he simply stopped adjusting. His knees didn't lock, his shoulders didn't brace, his breath didn't rush ahead of meaning. He stood, not rigid, not braced, just present. Still, the sky didn't fall. The stars didn't scatter. The cosmos, if anything, seemed to approve. Atlas closed his eyes, not from weariness, but from recognition. There was a lesson hidden in the hush. That stillness wasn't weakness. It was trust. Trust that the world could spin without violence. Trust that worth wasn't tied to motion. Trust that after defiance and duty, there might still be something sacred in silence. Time moved differently in surrender. Without the urgency of rebellion or the posture of punishment, Atlas began to feel time as texture, not as a race, but as a rhythm. The moments between stars had weight now, not like the skies. This was softer, fuller, nourishing. He began to feel his own name again, not shouted in battle, not cursed in exile. Just Atlas, a being, not a role, a soul, not a symbol. He noticed how his muscles, long fused to strain, slowly softened, not into weakness, but into a deeper kind of strength, the kind that listens, the kind that waits, the kind that doesn't need applause. He no longer sought release. He sought relationship with the burden, with the stars, with the silence. And in that gentleness, something remarkable happened. The ache began to become meaning. Even in his newfound stillness, Atlas could still feel echoes of who he had been. There were days when his fingers curled as if around a long-lost spear, when his spine aligned in battle stance without meaning to, when his thoughts marched, ordered, defiant, sharpened like arrows. These were not flaws, they were fossils, remnants of a former life etched into the marble of his being. He let them rise, not to banish them, but to greet them, to acknowledge the self that had once believed only in motion, in victory, in shouting the world into shape. But rest didn't erase rebellion, it refined it. Atlas learned to hold those memories the way he held the sky, without resistance, without resentment, just presence. In doing so, he found what the war had never promised. Peace, not as absence of struggle, but as integration of the self. It wasn't just for him. Atlas began to suspect that his stillness echoed outward. Birds began to nest along the crook of his shoulders. Stars circled with steadier grace above his crown. The wind softened, like it too had been waiting for someone to stop running. The world seemed to lean into him, not for support, but for example. Mortals prayed not for Atlas to act, but simply to remain. He had become a fixed point, a celestial lighthouse for weary eyes. In his stillness, others found direction. And Atlas, who once believed the only way to matter was to move mountains, began to believe something quieter, that being fully and completely was enough. He didn't need to win. He didn't need to prove. He needed only to stay, and in doing so, remind the cosmos that rest is not retreat. It is the root of all resilience. There is a breath that happens just before collapse and just after salvation. Atlas lived inside that breath now, not in struggle, not in triumph, but in the pause between them. In that in-between, he discovered something no rebellion could give and no punishment could destroy. Dignity, not the pride of being seen, the peace of being. And that, he realized, was enough to change everything. Atlas remembered the war, yes. The searing light of Olympus, the roar of fallen titans. But he did not need to relive it to honor it. Stillness, he had learned, didn't erase memory. It reframed it. What had once been loud now returned as texture. What had been wound now came back as wisdom. He did not need to march through pain again to feel its lesson. He could sit beside it and let it speak softer truths. What greater defiance could there be than to refuse to break, to rest, knowing the world still spins, to breathe, knowing not every scar must be explained. Atlas did not rest because he was done. He rested because he was becoming. And in a universe obsessed with motion, his stillness was not surrender. It was the most sacred kind of protest. They had watched him rage. They had watched him break. They had watched him rise again. Now, they watched him rest, and they wept, not tears, but light. Constant, ancient light. In that silence, Atlas realized he was never alone beneath the sky. The stars were witnesses. So were the winds, the shadows, the watchers on earth. All of them had seen, and not one had turned away. Over time, the line between Atlas and the earth began to blur. He was not merely standing on the world. He was part of it. The roots of olive trees crept toward him, drawn by his stillness. Stones whispered of his weight in the languages of pressure and time. Even passing storms adjusted their paths, as if not to disturb his sacred stance. He had become not just bearer of the sky, but keeper of balance. Not force, not glory, just presence. Atlas had once believed peace was the absence of pain. But now he knew peace was presence, deep and undisturbed. He had not given up. He had grown into the space between what he carried and who he was. He had learned to rest with the burden, not because it grew lighter, but because he grew wiser. And that, perhaps, was the quietest revolution of all. Silence had once unnerved Atlas. In his youth, it had felt like absence, like punishment. But now, it enveloped him like velvet. It wasn't empty. It was full of time, of meaning, of a presence deeper than words. In the hush between stars, Atlas heard everything. The pulse of mountains, the stretch of roots beneath the earth, the slow orbit of time itself. And in that silence, he heard himself again. Patience wasn't something Atlas was born with. It was sculpted, day by day, breath by breath, under the weight of a sky that didn't budge. He stopped measuring time in hours. He measured it in acceptance. Patience became not a pause, but a practice. A faith that not every storm needed resisting. a truth that not every question needed answering today. Some wisdoms bloom only when nothing is forced. So much had been stripped from him: his rebellion, his family, his place among the stars. But not everything was taken. No one could take his ability to remain. No one could rob him of the grace he discovered beneath the burden. And when all else was surrendered, he held on to one thing: the quiet conviction that staying, truly staying, was a kind of immortality too. And so the Titan stands, not as a monument to struggle, but as a living pause in a world obsessed with motion. He does not rise in rebellion. He does not fall in defeat. He simply stays, still, present, listening. Because sometimes the most courageous act is not to lift the world, but to remain whole beneath it, to choose presence over performance, silence over noise, peace over endless striving. We walk away from this story not with answers, but with a question. What are you holding that could be set down, not in surrender, but in sacred rest? The stars are still watching. The sky is still turning. And somewhere, deep in the hush between your breaths, Atlas is still there, waiting, not for release, but for understanding.